Hello and welcome to the home of the coziest conversations on the net. This is Benjamin Boyce, and today's conversant is Joseph Jake Klein. He is the author of Redefining Racism and the head editor of Black Sheep Publishing. He's also an atheist and a liberal. And in this conversation, we talk about what I've been exploring recently about the post-liberal or liberal skeptical points of view that are not coming from the woke left, but rather from the right. And we explore freedom of association, liberty, power, authority, the federal government, and all sorts of different ways in which liberalism has failed and can still succeed. You can find Jake's work linked in the description. And if you enjoy this content, consider liking, subscribing, and donating via the links below. Without further ado, here is Jake Klein.
Hi, how are you, Benjamin?
I'm good. How you doing, Jake?
Good. It's great to see you again. It's been a while since we last did this.
Yeah, you're still standing.
I'm still standing, and I feel so guilty the last time I was on because I gave you such an issue with my footage that I delivered to you. It was my first time like running this camera setup to like film myself doing an interview, and I didn't realize that like the camera overheats if you both record and stream at the same
Oh,
time.
yeah. Yeah.
So I'm not recording for you this time, but you'll have the nice stream footage.
Okay. All right.
And your setup's looking great too.
Yeah, you're getting the low quality feed. I do the high quality feed in-house because it
Yeah.
overheats, so split it up. What's up with the plushie? What's the symbolism there?
This
Is this the
is
new radical centrist demagogue just dropped?
oh my God, I hope I'm not a radical centrist. I've written I think enough against them.
Hmm.
It's a sheep because my fiance and I we run a publication that we're growing called the Black Sheep.
Okay.
So so we have a little sheep.
What's the spread for what you're publishing or the content topic?
So a lot of it's we work with people that have gone through this kind of black sheep experience in their life in one way or another. This experience of having some idea or perspective that's in conflict with the collective that they're surrounded by.
Hmm.
And that when they try to bring this idea to the collective, they are treated with hostility. And, they have to make the path, they have to make the choice to take their own path. Um, and so, we have a lot of stories of, I mean, leftists or former leftists like realizing leftism is not correct and choosing to go their own way. So a lot of we have a couple ones I think from feminists that sort of realized how
Hmm.
feminism was harming them personally, harming their marriages, and looking for a new outlook. One that did very well, and I think it's just a beautiful story, is from a uh, somebody who grew up under communism in Romania and went into academia in the West, and started noticing in her departments how it slowly began to mirror the type of society that she
Hmm.
had seen where she grew up. Um, so, we don't want to like limit ourselves to social justice issues and,
Yeah.
like leaving the tribe from leftism. We also have a lot of articles that are just trying to have those challenging takes. So,
Hmm.
um, for our listeners, the last time I was on this show, we talked about like atheism and its role in like the political right. So that's obviously a take that like if you're in the political right, you probably don't hear a lot. So
Hmm.
trying to find those kind of challenging takes and offer them to where they maybe need to be heard but aren't being heard. Another topic I've written a lot about is Zionism and the impact of Zionism on our politics. I was raised Jewish, uh, Orthodox Jewish. I was raised to be very Zionist, but I've come to different perspectives about the Jewish nationalism and its effect on the region and its effect on our country in terms of our geostrategic
Mm. Hmm.
incentives.
Yeah.
So offering those takes as well.
Yeah. What happens to the left me folk? Have you, it sounds like you've interacted with at least some smattering of sampling of them. Is there a, kind of a 5 steps of going from cringe to based, kind of like, the 5 stages of grief
Wait,
kind of thing?
sorry, left me. What is that, a meme that I'm not
Uh,
aware of?
yeah, it's just a kind of a meme. I didn't leave the left left me. Colin Wright made
Oh,
a
yeah,
rather,
yeah.
memeable meme about that, but it was kind of a meme before then.
I have he sells
Oh,
prints of that meme. So Colin's a friend of mine. He gave me a signed
well,
print
there we
of
go.
that meme. So I have that up in another room in my
So
house.
you identify with that subset of
No,
people?
me personally,
No.
no. But
Okay.
he made that, and he's a friend, and I think it's a great meme. Me, I left the left at a different, and we're telling a lot of the stories now of people that left over social justice issues, over wokeness,
Yeah.
and the left just kind of betraying the values that it at one time claimed to stand for. For me, I left because of Ron Paul's presidential campaigns in 2008 and 2012. So,
Okay.
I grew up in the context. How old are you, Benjamin?
Probably twice your age, I'm gonna guess.
Really? Can you tell me, or is it a secret?
I'm just shy of 50.
Oh, wow, really? Okay, so
Yeah.
you are older than me. So I'm 33. So,
Okay.
I grew up in the context of the you look great for your age. I would have
Yeah.
had no idea.
You don't want to know what's going
Um,
on in my basement.
um, so I grew up in the context of the Iraq War. So, I retain very much that anti-war perspective.
Hmm.
Um, but at that time, that just meant you were on the left, right? So as a teenager, I was on the left because I opposed the Bushes.
Hmm.
Um,
And that
and
folded right into the Wall Street. What's that called? The 1% protest.
Oh,
The
no,
Wall
no, no.
Street
I was
protest. Yeah.
that was like 2013, 2014, I think. So
Oh yeah, I was
I
just
was,
fast forwarding time. Like the same kind
yeah.
of people who were gathering to, denounce the war in Iraq, kind of snowballed into Occupy Wall Street. That's what it was called.
Well, that's the question, is which type of people, right? The leftists, in large part, did. So when I was a teenager, really had no understanding of economics. And I would say stupid things like, why can't we just print money to solve this problem? Like,
Hmm.
immense stupidity. Like, I would really think that if Republicans didn't want to have some government program to help the poor, it was because they hated the poor, not
Right.
because there might be a better way to solve that problem. So when Ron Paul came out in those debates and he started talking in a way that I agreed with on the issue that was most important to me, I was willing to give him a hearing on those issues where I did not agree because I did not know enough. And I started learning about and reading Austrian economics. And then from there, I'm an anarcho-capitalist, so I am,
Hmm.
all the way free market economics. And I would say on social issues, I probably am about where I was back then. So if you're looking just at social issues, it probably is more of the left me sort of situation.
Yeah.
But
So what?
yeah,
Just draft that the social issues. So are you saying social liberal or social progressive, fiscal conservative
yeah,
kind of
I would
thing?
say social progressive. Like, I supported gay marriage. That was a big political issue back then. I continue to support gay marriage. I don't support believing that gender is some postmodern concept that you can rearrange however you want, totally
Hmm.
divorced from the reality of biological sex.
Hmm. Hmm. Just to drill down in that issue, so marriage is a social contract. So that can be swapped around irregardless of the sex of the people who are
I
entering
didn't
into that.
I didn't say contract, I said construct,
Yeah, I know.
right?
That was the
You,
pun.
you can I love contracts. I'm a libertarian. Contracts are my favorite
Yeah.
things in the world. I want to organize our entire society around contracts. Um, so yeah, you can choose to create different patterns of living. Some of those patterns will be harmful, some of those patterns will be beneficial, some may be more neutral, but you can't change reality.
Hmm.
And if you're living in a delusion about reality, that's not healthy for you. That's not healthy for society or anyone.
Yeah. Well, but the gay marriage issue could be construed from somebody who's more socially conservative as one of those Chesterton fence issues that once we dismantled the contract
Mhm.
of marriage between a man and a woman, that opened up that contract to all varieties of sexual orientations and mixes and matches, up to and including polyamory or polygamy and stuff like that. So
Okay, so
that was one contract or social construct that is prehistorical, or at least very historical, and
mhm,
we dismantled that in the name of what, freedom of association.
mhm.
But
So
what are your considerations about you know, the knockoff effects of that, or the downstream effects of that particular fence being rearranged?
okay, so I wanna first let me untangle one thing, and then I'll answer to what I think you were trying to get at. So we did not untangle a contract. A contract is between two parties. So like the social contract that we often hear about of why we have to, pay our taxes and get drafted into the military and, all the things that the government can hold authority over us. That's not a contract. There's two parties, or I guess you can have more than that, but every party enters it with consent and the full knowledge of the other parties. So
Yeah.
that's not a contract. Now, what you're talking about is, I think, there's probably a better word for this, but like a general social arrangement. And if what you're trying to get at is that two-parent households are very important and have utility, and that this convention of traditional marriage arose for good and important reasons. And if we start allowing all of these other arrangements, then we get ourselves into problem territory because we lose what we were at first developing and then conserving with traditional marriage. 100%, I agree with you. I think I have become, in fact, this is not like the left me situation. Like I have consciously come to agree more with your perspective on that, which is that I think when I was younger, I didn't understand the value of a lot of these older traditions.
Hmm.
And so I just wanted to like, you know, reorganize things. But I
Hmm.
was doing that from a perspective of not really trying to understand how things got to be the way that they are in the first place to begin with.
Hmm.
And you can go dangerous places
Yeah.
when that's the case. So, so in terms of gay marriage specifically, I think to me it's clear that it's the case that there are certain people that are just gay. They're not going to be happy in a straight marriage, and they can try to force it, but it's going to be miserable for them. Okay. Now there's a large population that is bisexual or potentially bisexual. And I think that gay marriage is probably a less ideal form of marriage than traditional straight marriage. I think that I think having kids is very important. Um, and I think that both a mother and father are psychologically wired to bring different things towards child rearing. So that would be, I think, the main reason why it's not ideal. so I think if you're bisexual or potentially bisexual, you want to encourage people to not be gay. But I think there's a substantial population of people that are not bisexual. They truly are gay. They're going to be miserable in a traditional marriage, and we should have acceptance for that. We should, I think, welcome those people into our community and our societies because I think it's cruel not to. But at the same time, I don't want to see a pendulum shift into that being a norm. And then it becomes a slippery slope, and you get into these even more maladaptive and unsustainable situations like, we're all going to marry into polycules or, whatever
Well,
craziness.
sorry. I, I revealed my hands. I'm trying to be neutral here. But just to go back, and thank you for allowing me to play the devil's advocate. I don't know what the audience will think about my own point of view, but I think it's interesting territory. The tensions here, because you say there are certain people who are gay, period.
Mhm.
And then there's a group of people who are bisexual who go either way. And if
Mhm.
the norm is prioritizing and even idealizing the heterosexual relationship, then they'll be kept, through pressures, they'll end up being heterosexual. But if we swap out the word heterosexual and homosexual for monogamous, most people are not
Mhm.
monogamous. But we had, up until, I don't know, the 60s, a
Mhm.
lot of explicit social pressure. And there
Mhm.
have been times in, recent history, last couple hundred years, where in different pockets of society, there was a loosening, like you can think of Victorian England versus probably Victorian France. I know that's a contradiction in terms, but French were probably more open to the erotic and, like having
Mhm.
mistresses and stuff like that, where this, at least in the memeified version of Victorian England, there was more of a strict social role and pressure on certain things.
Mhm.
If we lose the ability to call out or to pressure people to be monogamous as opposed to polyamorous, there's a bunch of downstream effects of that. And in the strict libertarian framework, where everything is based on contract and everything is based on
Mhm.
consent and between two parties, it
Mhm.
doesn't seem to reach the ability to conceptualize without arguing against or taking a stand against social pressures
Mhm.
that make people do what they don't want to do because it's to the benefit
Yeah.
of greater society. So, how does
Yeah.
one, as a libertarian leaning person, square that? Like, you
I'm
kind
so
of want to
happy
be a better.
you I'm so happy you asked me that question because this is what I DM'd you about in terms of I've been listening to a lot of your episodes and you've had, you take a post-liberal perspective, and I've really been enjoying your show like a lot lately. I listened to your Martyr Made episode. I listened to your Jeremy Kaufman episode. I listened to your Clint Russell episode. I listened to a couple other ones with people I can't remember the names. And I just like, I think you've been nailing it. But I remember there's a moment in
Mm,
that Martyr Made one where you talk about liberalism being, or maybe he talked about it, but you both agree about being this dissolving force in society where it becomes its own undoing. And I disagree with you and him on that, but I think the concerns that you're raising are very much right. So first of all, I mean, just with gay marriage, I just think it's, and with a lot of this stuff, I think that it's possible to hold in your mind at once that we allow this for certain people in certain situations, but we don't hold it as an overall good. So I think that's possible. The type of society that I personally want to live in holds that, and I do think that's sustainable. Perhaps the course of the future will prove me wrong, but I
mm,
don't think it will. Um, However, I agree with the general principle that you're laying out of you want to have communities that adhere to certain social norms that are positive, are productive, that lead to eudaimonia. I think that liberalism, as I understand it, is the absolute best way to get there. When you had Jeremy Kauffman on, one of the things that he mentioned is that, he's a libertarian. I know he's a libertarian, but that he's doesn't like classical liberals. That to me is with all respect to Jeremy, a confused understanding. Libertarianism is nothing but a particular strand of classical liberalism. Classical liberalism, I think it's like kind of vague. When I think of classical liberalism, what I think of is Locke, life, liberty, and property, a system of respect for individual rights. What I don't necessarily think of, and what I think I hear coming out in your post-liberal perspective, is it's almost like multiculturalism. Like liberalism just means like tolerance and acceptance for everything. Now, someone that I think is in the classical liberal tradition as a libertarian is Hans Hermann Hoppe. And if you're familiar with Hoppe's work at all, one of the ideas that you might be familiar with is his ideas of covenant communities, which would be these communities, relatively small, that would self-govern and that are self-segregating. So people that are not aligned with the community's standards, the phrase that he famously uses and many memes have been made about, are physically removed, okay? By which he means not that violence should be used against these people necessarily, but that they will have to be in a different place. They will live in a different society because the contract law governing this one will not allow them to be part of it. So I really believe also in the idea of federalism in the American founding, and this idea that we were going to have a bunch of different states. I think states are actually much too large, but that we're going to have different systems and that we're going to govern themselves their own way, and we would have a bunch of different experiments. So I think it's very important that people have individual rights and the ability to contract into a society that, might live in some horribly hedonistic way that I totally disagree with. And they should be over there and we should be over here, right? And so we don't have to tolerate that in our spaces. And I think, in fact, it's liberalism. It's that idea of individual rights and property that is what protects that and what allows that. Because otherwise, what you have is either democracy, where you have the 51% of these people that you don't necessarily want to be in your society controlling the whole thing, or you have a monarch or whoever who's making those determinations for you and your community. And like we've seen at many points in history, maybe oppressing your religion or whatever it may be. So, that's why I believe liberalism is absolutely the best way to achieve the society that I think you're looking for.
Okay. So again, this is great stuff. And it's interesting. I'm trying to float ideas without necessarily saying that these are ideas that I think, but these are ideas that attract me because there's some sort of tension in there that I want to unravel. But if you have a bunch of different communities, let's say in the state of Michigan, let's just say Michigan, and let's try to ignore the ethnic and, well, not so much the ethnic, but the racial component of that. But there are just different people who have different traditions and different values. And they self-segregate to begin with. And yet they're all in an economic relationship because they, let's say they all use the same currency. And then there is some sort of need to barter with each other, trade with each other and stuff. So they're not just localized. They still have to make arrangements. If you speed up that story of like this Michigan, this kind of a city state or something, covenant community, broken down Michigan, 20 years, you're going to have this economic disparity that begins to announce itself. You'll also have creative disparities that announce themselves. Maybe the urban centers draw and attract more creative people because there's more ability to play around with certain ideas, whereas in more conservative communities, they push people out or disattract people in one way or another, reject people one way or another from playing around with ideas. So they kind of lose creative capital, but they keep on marching along because they're more conservative. They're more dedicated to living a certain way that gives dividends to the people who maintain that. But you're going to have these economic disparities, and that's what we see. So you have people living in extreme poverty over here, people living in, just kind of like this middle class, trenchant, kind of like repetitive lifestyle, but it's very, very stable. And then you have people that are kind of coming up with new technologies and innovations, making tons of money in the freedom that they have. But isn't there going to be some sort of organization that's going to try to help the people who are over time, due to their lifestyles, spending their human capital, wasting themselves away? And then where are they going to get that capital but from the innovators and from the conservative people, the middle class and the upper class? And somebody's going to figure out a system, and they're going to call it government, and they're going to call it government programs to go around and start to solve these problems, because they're going to see these problems that need to be solved. So doesn't it, I just can kind of see, and I'm not articulating the question correctly yet, but I see a story where inevitably in the state of Michigan, or the smaller kind of country, that there's going to be this disparity that's going to cause, it's going to be like this pustule of depravity over here, and somebody's going to have to clean it up. So isn't there going to be like a call for some sort of paternalism or some sort of government program to fix or reset or keep people below a certain level of depravity, whether economic depravity or even social depravity?
So in a statist world, yes, but that's what we need to move away from. Also, because you talked about economics being the solvent, and how that forces you to interact with other people. Now, there's some truth to that, right? I mean, I don't know what you're going to do to deal with that. If you want the gains of markets and trade, there's no other way to create wealth at any comparable level. You're dooming yourself to poverty, except for trading with people who are different than you. I mean, that's not something that, let's say you controlled the whole country. Well, you still have to trade with other countries, or else you're economically isolationist, and you'll have the same economic situation as any country that we've put tons of sanctions on, right? You'll have the economy of Cuba or Iran or something. You'll just have done it to yourself. Yeah. So, you have to be able to say, unless I'm going to full-blown conquer the world, which is a very costly and deadly thing to do, I have to be okay with other people living their way. When I go to interact and trade with them, that's what I do. And then I go back to my community, and we keep up these strong, perhaps psychological barriers, but certainly physical barriers, social barriers. You might want to not have a lot of the internet or something like that. It's very hard. We're in this modernist world, and we do have to figure out how to solve it. And that's something I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I don't necessarily have answers to. The Amish might be one example. I don't think I'd want to live like the Amish. Okay, so that's not the answer for me or the community that I would want to build and live in. But it's an answer, and I think they're entitled. It's a very extreme answer, but they have protected their community doing that. So I wonder if there's, and I think that there is more mild ways of getting to a place where you can control your environment a little bit more without totally shunning everything of modern technology. But we have to work to develop it, and that's going to take time and effort and thinking. Now, okay, so you talked about economics doing that, but as I said, I don't think there's too much we can do about that without just punching ourselves in the face and making our own lives worse off. And I think the biggest solvent anyway, it's not economics, it's the state. We used to have much better community ties in this country, as I'm sure you know well. And it was the progressive era. It was in large part this force that you're talking about of people trying to loot. Frederick Bastiat, a French economist, would call this legal plunder. He has a whole essay on this that I would really recommend. Um, of taking from productive people and unproductive people, using the state to steal that wealth. And that's really bad. And we saw that happen in the progressive era, and it's only gotten worse. And what we saw is as people started going to the state for these things, you saw the disillusion of a lot of the things that tied communities together. So schools became public schools, right? And it threw everybody all into one basket. Mutual aid societies, which is where people in one community would contribute financially to help each other in times of need, got destroyed and replaced by Social Security, Medicare, and government entitlement programs. So, given the how much of these issues have come from the state, it seems to me that the need is to roll back the state, or given the issues of rolling back the state, be able to secede from the state, to remove yourself from that. These, let's just say socialists, because they're socialists, that you're describing, who plunder one group, they do so by capturing the mechanism of the state apparatus that everybody is in. I mean, apart from like prehistory, they generally don't do it by just conquering neighboring territories. I mean, there's wars for resources, like it definitely happens, but there's not, especially in the information economy, there's not generally wars to capture the productive capacity of other people's minds. Like, we don't really see that. So, if you look at communist revolutions, they took over the existing state apparatus. They maintained largely the borders that those countries had before. Then, some of them merged or joined alliances with each other, like the Soviet Union. But if we can reclaim and protect this right to secession, this right to exit, which I think is a core function of liberalism, the right to exit, the right to property, then that will ameliorate the greatest causes of the concerns that you have.
What do you think is happening? It's too early. So this guy, Donald J. Trump, just got elected, and he's assembling a cabinet right now, like the Megavengers or something like that. And they're making a lot of hubbub about, this Office of DOGE, Department of Government Exile, hopefully.
Efficiency.
Efficiency.
I hope so, yeah.
Yeah. What do you think the likelihood of them being able to pull that off, and the downstreams effect of this massive, from the government point of view, downscaling of government? There's got to be trade-offs on.
I'm not as optimistic about it as I would be about secessionist movements, like really gaining steam. Peaceful secessionist movements. That's very important. Remember that civil wars are caused by the group that tries to stop the secession, not the seceding party. Unless they fired weapons first, but that generally never happens because there's no point. They just want to leave. It's the other one that has to enact force to keep them. So with DOGE, I'm hopeful. I'm pessimistic to neutral, but there's a possibility that it will work. One of the things that makes me pessimistic is that it's not an actual government agency with a legal force. It's going to be some outside government thing giving advice. And so there's no mechanism to make sure that its recommendations are followed. I would. Now, the reason for that could be, I've seen some people speculate that there's disclosure laws and conflict of interest laws that would prevent somebody like Elon Musk from taking a formal position inside an actual government agency. And so this is just some loophole to get around that. And yeah, it might weaken it, but it's still a very serious effort. I hope that's the case. Um, I also think that Elon and Vivek are extremely intelligent people, and I don't think they would involve themselves in this at such a serious level unless they thought it had a serious shot. And I notice that they're going to be giving their recommendations shortly before the 2026 midterms and also America's 250th anniversary.
Hmm.
And I suspect, I hope, I think I'm smart for thinking this. I hope they thought of it first and are smarter than me, that this is a strategy where there's still going to be the trifecta in the House and Senate. They'll still have the ability to pass things with budgetary impact through budget reconciliation, and that they will use this idea of restoring America to its heritage that will be really in the spirit of the conversation at this time in 2026 to pressure Republican legislators to pass a bill, a budget reconciliation bill that includes all their cuts all at once. And those that don't pass it are going to get primaried in 26 and lose. So they will have extraordinary pressure to pass this bill that they're going to message in a way tied to the anniversary that will be very popular.
Hmm.
So if they can pull that off, if that's what they're trying to do, and if they can pull that off, which are some really big ifs, then I think it could make a major positive difference for this country.
Mm-hmm. So if the government can be decreased in its stranglehold of the citizens, where does that power or that vacuum revert to? What do you think the trickle down? If the federal government becomes more federalist, do you think the states will pick up the slack there, or do you think that there will be a release of tremendous amounts of innovative pressure, financial transactions, because we're not going to be burdened, hopefully, by as much taxes and regulations, I guess? Do you think that these vacuums where all these agencies, were, and I don't know, if you think about it, it's way beyond my pay grade, but like there's so much civil rights law itself that's used to police people, to force people to act in certain progressive ways, that needs to be untangled. I don't know if that's a government efficiency thing, but I don't know how the law gets solved. But I'm just wondering, how do we get to a place where your ideal world is possible in America? Like where people can self-segregate, where even that word segregation is a legal term, and it's illegal to behave in that way. It's illegal to segregate.
Yeah, we have. I just see this pattern so many times through history, and it's part of what we're trying to talk about at the Black Sheep, of people notice one problem and then they just totally pendulum swing the other way and forget that original problem, yeah, it was a problem, but it had something valid in it that you didn't want to lose. So very controversially, let's talk about racial segregation for a second. Racial segregation is absolutely evil. Okay. My book, Redefining Racism, is very much, the whole argument of the book is in favor of treating everybody equally, restoring the concept of colorblindness. So I really believe in that. I believe in civil rights. I would have been there fighting for all this, right?
Mm-hmm.
But what we forgot is that not all segregation is racial segregation. And so we took this idea of, oh, we're not treating people right. We're taking them out of our society, making them live in separate spaces, and forgot that there might be certain groups that are actually believe a certain way, hold certain ideas that are toxic to you and your group, and that you don't want to have around, that aren't racist. They're not bigoted. They're not based on somebody's immutable identity. It's based on the choices that they have made and the ideas that they hold. And so, in the name of the 100% positive good of ending this bigoted past segregation, we've thrown out the idea of any kind of segregation as being immoral and forgot what like the baby in that concept was. And we do have to restore that a little bit in a much, much, much better way that does not look anything like that past one. So
Even up to and
it's going to be
including
philosophy you have to teach.
even up to and including allowing racists to self-segregate.
You have so as a classical liberal, you have to allow that legally. Now, I would never, when we're picking, what communities we're going to live in our Hoppian covenant community society, I would not live in one that does that. I would have major, major issues with that. I would not want the ideology from that community, reaching my children when they're too young to understand it. I do believe in free speech and countering bad ideas and, rational inquiry and all that. I think I would want my community to engage with those ideas, but in a certain context, where, it's not going to influence kids before they're too young to really think about it clearly. But, they should all, for some reason, Idaho always gets brought up as the place where all the white supremacists should go. I don't know why that is, but I guess there's a lot of them there or something. I'm sorry to all the wonderful Idahoans. But they should go form their community in Idaho where there's, no black people around there and peacefully be racist white supremacists. And they should remove themselves from the rest of our society. And to me, that is a peaceful and positive solution.
Would you have economic relations?
Have these racists.
Would you
have economic relations?
Yeah. With that woman,
I think I
would.
Yeah, I think I would. They can be racist. That doesn't mean that, Southern racists, I'm sure, have some of the best barbecue there is. I'll happily.
They're probably not as racist as we Northerners perceive them as.
Yeah, I mean, listen, if they opened up again, if they somehow got access to open up a racist barbecue that did not seat black people in my community, I would boycott that business.
Okay.
I would not want that around me. If they're living peacefully, having self-segregated themselves, not trying to push their segregation into other people's communities, and they're shipping their farmed brisket out, then, that's a peaceful economic interaction. They have really terrible ideas, but lots of people have lots of different really terrible ideas. And so long as they're not actively harming others with their terrible ideas, I will still interact with them. Like I don't feel that my purchase of that brisket and my importing of it is doing any harm to anyone because they've already taken themselves out of the place where they can cause harm.
The paradox of tolerance dogs liberalism, because it's on one level it's supposed to be as hands-off as possible, but on another level that liberalism can't function without certain values of self-governance, right? Self-responsibility, self-restraint, economic responsibility. So you have to teach those principles and enforce softly those principles in order for liberalism to actually flourish. Without, and by that I mean a non-authoritarian, like a polity of these covenant communities. There's got to be a word for like some sort of like Grecian kind of like. There's all these different kind of experiments in social living, and they're kind of tied together. And at some point, there can be an economic unity, or there can be an authoritarian unity, a warlike unity that kind of comes over and then tells them to do something or organizes them in a fashion so that they can either defend themselves or conquer or expand their ability. So I'm just saying, all these different communities, there's some sort of fascia or aporia, some sort of gap between them wherein the state or the empire continually exerts itself. There's a power vacuum, it seems like. So there has to be a liberal superstructure that checks power, but that is itself the power that can check any greater power, right? Does that make sense to you?
I'm not totally sure if I perfectly followed that last part, but let me try to answer. And if I get it wrong, just
Yeah,
push
or
me
you
again.
just restate
So,
it. I can do better. I can do better.
so you're correct for sure that liberalism is an idea, and for it to be practiced, people have to understand and want to hold to that idea. Um, and you have to have institutions that do that. I don't think those institutions have to be run by the state. Historically, they were not run by the state. Um,
Are you talking about
that
education
I'm talking
institutions?
about education, but also, education is really kind of the big one, but it's also churches or, wherever in society people just kind of get their values from. Could
Yeah.
be entertainment, could be, whatever it may be.
Mm.
Um, and also, it's the case that defense is a very important part of protecting liberal society. We have to have a military, how that military should be run and who has it exactly, or maybe some interesting questions in like anarcho-capitalist theory.
Hmm.
But also the Second Amendment is very important, the right to own arms yourself, to defend yourself, and for local communities to do so, to defend themselves. Now, I also believe potentially in defense compacts where they're rational. There's defense compacts that the United States is in right now, namely NATO, that I don't think are actually in the US's
Right.
geostrategic interests.
Yeah.
But in principle, I'm okay with defensive alliances. So if you have a bunch of neighboring liberal societies that share a content, they're all close by, they share the same threats to their liberal society, and they should enter a defense compact together to defend against the places where these ideas are not being taught and might pose a threat to their society. I think that this can be done voluntarily, although that is one of the most challenging parts of anarcho-capitalist theories, how we would have a military.
Hmm.
But let's say you're a minarchist, right? Which in libertarianism means like you support the ultra minimal state rather than no state. Um,
Hmm.
then okay, so fine, you tax and you fund it that way, but that doesn't mean that you have to grow other parts of the state. It
Hmm.
doesn't mean that all of these communities have to delegate all their authority upwards. I don't think there's anything that requires that. You haven't seen that from the Amish. You haven't
Hmm.
seen that from the ultra Orthodox Jewish community. These
Yeah.
are not communities that at all resemble the ones that I would want to live in, but they are kind of first movers in trying to keep things as local and self-controlled as possible. And they have been harmed in their rights by the surrounding groups that tax them and pass regulations and laws about
Hmm.
what they can do. So if we can get enough of us that really believe in this idea of self-rule, then they've
Hmm.
been maintaining those ideas successfully.
Yeah.
And if it works for them, we can form a compact together and protect this liberalism. It all starts with philosophy and ideas. We have to talk to people, we have to teach people, and we have to help them understand that this is what liberalism properly believed and practiced looks like or can look like.
Hmm.
And
Has
it's
real
up to us to bring it
liberalism
about.
has real liberalism ever been tried?
So maybe I shouldn't have said the word liberalism there because what I really mean is libertarianism. Liberalism is a vague phrase, right?
Yeah.
So when it says, has real liberalism been tried? Well, it's vague enough that sure.
Well,
but a
but
more specific branch of libertarianism has not. I mean,
okay.
liberalism absolutely was practiced by the American founding. It was practiced with, I guess this predates liberal being a phrase, but with the Magna Carta,
Yeah.
with lots of
Checks on power.
societies, checks on power, and the valuing of individual rights and the
Mm.
understanding of contracts and property.
Hmm. It's really difficult for a nation to go backwards. I mean,
I
other
agree.
than downward. So the United States articulated some phenomenal documents, phenomenal ideals. With our Declaration of Independence, our Constitution. But if you look at the history of it, within two generations, Hamilton, right, within 20 years, Hamilton sets up the Federal Reserve. He starts to set
Mhm.
up the deep state, because it's one thing for all these different actors to be getting along, but if they bind themselves together, then they become a world power. And then they have leverage against, the threats to the West and threats to the
Mhm.
East, and they have trading powers. And how Hamilton went about binding the states together was by taking out debt. It's really interesting. He used this leverage of debt. And then you have the progressive era with Dewey and Wilson and stuff. It keeps on
Mhm.
ratcheting up, and
Mhm.
then the Federal Reserve, and then the going off the gold standard, and then the world. Well, I'm getting my dates all mixed up. The world wars. Like there's this increasing encroachment, or
Mhm.
this increasing bloat of this federal government, and this state that lives upon its people, lives upon this land, rules this land, but doesn't really care about this land, doesn't really care about this people, is more cared about global interests and shipping the people out here and there, and doing all these deals. And it seems like with the MAGA Trump era, or MAGA itself, insofar as it can outshine or outlive Trump, it's this kind of reemergence of what you were saying about like the possibility of returning to at our 250th anniversary, returning to our founding original ideals. But that egregore, that entity of the federal government, that
Mhm.
Cthulhu, I don't see how you can break that up. I just don't see how it's going to allow itself to go backwards. I mean, it can degenerate for sure, but
Mhm.
it always only can go forward. What do you Yeah, what is that like a that's kind of my pessimistic outtake. I see these liberal ideals being great for people who opt into them, but I don't see them being strong enough to wrest power and really break apart that deep state, that Leviathan, that blob. Everybody's coming up with tons of words for this thing.
Well, historically, it was. I mean, if you look at the American Revolution, it was then. If you look at other similar revolutions around the world, it was then. If you look at
Mm,
even peaceful
yeah,
revolutions that led to the downfall of the Soviet Union
yeah,
and other such entities, it happened then. But I think that you're correct. Like once you build Leviathan, it's very hard to undo that through Leviathan itself,
yeah.
because Leviathan has those incentives. Um, that's why I said before, I'm also somewhat pessimistic about DOGE. Like, I'm hopeful. I think it could work, but if I had to give it If I had to give it
Odds.
odds,
Let's
it's
take it to
somewhere it's
Polymarket or
somewhere
whatever
under
it's called.
50. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's probably somewhere between 30 and 40% is like
Yeah.
where I'm holding it. So like there's a real possibility, but it's not the majority likelihood of working. And that's why I support, national divorce or peaceful secession or
Mm.
whatever we want to call it, as I think more sustainable, because I think that sort of full blown tear the band-aid off, like exit all at once,
Hmm.
is much easier to do than to actually roll back Leviathan. And if we can keep doing that, if we can get to a social understanding that this is allowable, those who love government and want to stay in Leviathan, you can not only can you keep controlling it, you are now going to have more power in how you control it because people are leaving. So this is so your vote share will increase. So this is in our mutual interest. Yes, you'll have less control over as large a territorial region, quite as many people, but what you continue to control, you'll have way more power over. So
Hmm.
you get that, we get the ability to exit, and we'll each stop interfering with each other. If we can convince people of this idea and to see it that way, and that this is good for both progressives and conservatives and libertarians and whatever your ideology, that all of us are going to get more control to make the system how we want it. I do think it's possible. I do think it's persuasive and compelling. Nobody's really messaged it that way. That's one of the projects I want to start working on
Oh.
more. So you can't really say that that's been tried at any level to seriously get progressives to see it that way,
Hmm.
as we're going to let you be more progressive
Yeah.
in your areas. You just have
Yeah.
to let us exit.
Go ahead and trans
I,
your kids and do until your entire
I hate it.
nothing. Nobody's left.
I hate it. But what I prefer it. I prefer that they can take over some small portion of California where they can do whatever crazy gender radical policies they want. They will harm a lot of kids, but it will collapse after some period of time rather than manage to get to 51% and force it on all of
Mm.
us, right? So,
Mm.
given that trade off, and I do think that's the trade off,
Mm.
I prefer the separate version of it. Um, yeah, there was more to your question I wanted
Is
to
this
say, but
tied to
I
like a
forgot.
regionalism? I mean, this would literally have to be a physical reality. The secessionary states.
I need to read there's that book by that crypto guy, The Network State. I
Hmm.
need to read that because I know that I know that there's ideas out there, and I think it's in that book about how you could actually potentially have like decentralized
Overlapping,
states
yeah.
in our current world. Yeah, where they're overlapping, but at the same time where
Yeah.
we do self govern despite being neighbors. That seems difficult for me to imagine, but
Yeah.
I want to give it a hearing before I reject it because I think that's very interesting.
If you look
Um,
at Neil Stephenson's first two books, Snow Crash and Diamond Age, he runs that
ah,
experiment fictionally, and they're really
okay.
entertaining books.
I've heard great things about that
Yeah.
book. Is the movie good? Can I watch that?
I don't think they have a movie. No, it's too good for a movie. It's
Don't they
like,
have a movie of Snow Crash? I thought
do they?
that was me.
I'll have to look.
I might be
No,
wrong.
there's something that I think it's like Snow Train or something. It's like a Korean film that was remade, and one of those Chris superhero guys was in it.
It's not called Snow Train, but I think we thought of the same movie, and it's Snow something.
Yeah,
And
and there
okay,
are different segments to the train. Yeah.
all right, I'll check out that book.
Do you recall when we last spoke? Was it 2 years ago? Three?
It was about probably 18 months ago.
Oh, okay. Well,
I
okay.
don't know
Lots happened in my
exactly,
life.
but
Okay.
probably about.
So I guess this question might not make much sense because it's a question and how your ideas have changed. But
Mm,
from the argument that we had, or the case that we discussed, the argument we discussed in our
mm,
first conversation about being an atheist on the right,
mm.
has your idea about the utilitarian usefulness of religion in fostering these communities and creating thicker communities changed at all? Rather than can atheism itself scale to unify a population in some sort of thicker cultural soup, or is religion still, from your point of view, kind of not necessarily backwards, but not necessarily ideal, or
I don't think my
necessary.
views have changed on this at all. And in fact, I had the wonderful opportunity. I opened on stage I gave a speech before Richard Dawkins at a
Mm,
Dawkins speaking event about 2 months ago, and recycled, many of the ideas that I was talking about back then. But if you'll recall, my take that makes me different from a lot of atheists was that I think that there's a lot from religion that needs to be conserved. And that, this pendulum swing of, oh, we're rejecting what's bad from a religion, so we're not seeking to understand it anymore, and we're just kind of throwing out everything. That happened there as well, like no question. But that was my opinion back then. So I don't think that's changed. I wanna, and I do think there's a community of atheists that understand that vibe. I'm part of a group called Atheists for Liberty. I think they understand this.
hmm
But I want to help more atheists understand that. Religious people that are trying to figure out their next step, I want to help them understand that. So we have to be able to build communities that do. But we have seen atheism or atheist philosophies bind society very successfully. They're the ones that we would both absolutely criticize, communism, right? But there's nothing inherent to a socially redistributive economy that comes out of atheism.
Mm.
Some of Ayn Rand, who I'm a big fan of, is a maximally free market atheist. I think Murray Rothbard, who's one of my biggest
Mm.
ideological influences, I think
hmm
he was an atheist. I heard some rumors he was thinking about converting to Catholicism at the end of his life, but he didn't do it. So,
Mm. Missed
I'm,
that
I'm,
boat.
yeah.
Mm.
So I'm pretty sure he stayed an atheist. Um, so there are people like us, and I think it's a matter of education and persuasion,
Mm.
and just the way that we have our current buckets now, where we talked about all of this last time, but cultural conservatism accompanies a psychological instinct towards conservatism broadly. And so you're going to see those things bunched together as where, progressive ideas are going to accompany being willing to change from the way things have historically been. So atheism is a big cultural change. So you're going to see those kind of things grouped together, but that's correlation, not causation,
Mm.
in my view. And I
Mm.
think I have strong evidence for that based on all the atheists you can find who are right wing. Um, so having said that, I am a strong believer in religious liberty for atheists and for religious believers of every kind. So I do think a lot of the communities that will come up in the type of society that I'm talking about are traditionally religious. They will probably have an easier time, at least at the start, instantiating the type of values that you're talking about because they've continued to hold on to it. But in the long run, I think that they're going to have problems with that because, just what we've seen over the last 100, 200 years of atheists come not from being born to atheists. Atheists come from religious families and leave because they don't believe the fact claims that are being made, and that causes them to drop all the other stuff too. So I want to provide a better avenue for atheists leaving religious backgrounds to go to where they don't do that total pendulum swing, and they can realize like, hey, there's a way to retain a lot of things that your community about your community that were good. There's a different story that we can tell
Mm.
that can carry those ideas forward while dropping the parts that are making you question why your family and your community believes this stuff that not to be true.
Hmm. What's that package then? What's that story?
It's going to be a lot of work, and it's it's the way that religions form historically. They kind of come through a gradual process, I don't think there's a religion. There's a distinction between religion and any other kind of ideological worldview. I think last time I was on, I called them meaning-making systems. That's
Hmm.
ultimately the thing that we're really looking at. And you you have to have when you see meaning making systems come about, right? Like if you see the communist narrative come about, this idea of that story that bound that community was the idea of the bourgeoisie exploiting the proletariat through this concept of surplus value that
Hmm.
Marx created, right?
Hmm.
And so that was a populist narrative that united all these people into revolting and forming their society that didn't work at all. Um, and so that comes about through a slow process. That comes about through a process of people being exploited at work through genuinely exploitive, historical work practices, a feudalism going back far enough. And
Hmm.
then you have a guy that provides some answers about why they feel that way in a way that's very convincing. And then you have multiple layers of people on top of that. If we were talking in religious language, we could call them prophets. In modern secular philosophy, we might call them philosophers
Hmm.
that develop upon that until you get the Marxism Leninism that became the effectively state religion of the Soviet Union. So I don't think any one person, such as me, can just kind of like completely create the thing. But what we can do is start telling different stories.
Hmm.
And one of them, I believe, I think will be the convincing one because I really do think it's there. Like it's clear to me how a lot of the values and lifestyle choices that were encoded in traditional religions are valuable.
Hmm.
It's also clear to me that the story is that they tell is failing to persuade people at sufficient numbers in the current day.
Hmm.
And so I do think if you have these great values that are there, there's gotta be
An
some
adaptation.
story
Yeah.
that can wrap those around. I mean, maybe the story is it's this tale of Western civilization.
Mm.
It's this tale of um, through the centuries, through the millennia, like people have built things. And I'm also cautious about saying that society is purely just a march towards progress because it's
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
But there have been certain things in there that have brought us to the next stage, and we don't always know when they'll come, and we don't always know what they are. But some of those things were in these religions. Some of these things were in prehistoric times. Some of these things were in the scientific revolution. And there's some motivating spirit that people can be a part of continuing that in a
Yeah.
way that brings them the deeper meaning that a meaning making system has to bind people. I think there's something there, but I'm not going to be the person to fully figure it out
Hmm.
and solve it on my own.
I'm thinking of something that's either slightly or highly offensive, depending on who's hearing me say it. But I'm saying it tongue in cheek. Something to the effect that atheists are kind of like gays. We all know that they exist, but we're not going to encourage and adulate them.
Mm-hmm.
They're not the end all be all of society. They are. The atheist is living in a religious world. The
Mm-hmm.
homosexual is living in a heterosexual world. And for most people and for most society, the pressure to be heterosexual and monogamous, I need to put that on
Mm-hmm.
top of it, is better for the aggregate. And I think atheism is the same thing. I think that atheism, kind of like libertarianism, it appeals to
Mm-hmm.
certain people with certain sensibilities and certain capacities for rational thought, and therefore a certain value that they place on rational thought over other modes of understanding, community making, breaking
Mm-hmm.
bread, and this probably even distaste or this disdain for the sacred rites, rituals, and the aesthetic experience that comes bundled in
Mm-hmm.
religion to a certain extent. I mean, I look at your background and I don't see any religious symbols there. But I could look at somebody who has the same amount of rationality as you, probably could have, like a icon on the wall that reminds them
Mm-hmm.
of some sort of sacred secret held in Mary holding baby Jesus. And there's some levels
Yeah.
of understanding that are vibrating through that, or vibing through
Mm-hmm.
that is an aesthetic accoutrement to their life, whereas the atheist is kind of more minimalist in their aesthetic. I'm kind of rambling, but I don't see how atheism scales, other
I
than
think
creating
that
another god out of the state or out of power or of the rational
mhm.
mind. That we inevitably, at scale, these things become, ideologies become indistinct from religion, and because they aren't religion, they lack certain metaphysical frameworks that hold things in line at scale. That like a transcendent God that is
Mhm.
above everybody else. That therefore, at every level of the chain of the hierarchy of the society, there's always something greater than you. There's always
Mhm.
something that's going to judge you ultimately. And I don't see atheism having something that can articulate that, as well as even that distasteful from a certain point of view word God. That
Yeah, I mean, I just
you'll
think we're gonna
inevitably
have
just reuse
to.
it.
I think we're just gonna have to disagree about the empirics here because it's clear to me that God is not maintaining that story at social scale. Like
Hmm.
you, you're seeing declining rates in traditional faiths by massive numbers over the last 100 years. So,
Mm-hmm.
you say from a philosophical sense that, oh, only it can do it, but it's not doing it. So, we
We'll
have to
see. I
look
mean,
for other
things
things
can
that can do it better.
maybe
Um,
things will change. It's interesting because what does our post-liberal secular society hold up as God? It's your self-will.
Well, but I also think there's other levels on which you're empirically not correct,
Hmm.
which is
Like
Eastern
China, or
religions.
yeah,
Yeah, Eastern
yeah.
religions that have bound societies. They have like ideas of spirits, and they definitely have religious narratives. But they don't have a concept of God in the same way in,
Hmm.
Buddhism, for example. So, but that is, I think the world's third largest religion, maybe fourth, maybe Hinduism is third. I can't recall, but it's massive, and that works. Um,
Hmm.
and even within Western religions, we have the Abrahamic faith that grew very large. It grew very large by force, in large part. But
In
we've
trade.
had and trade, yeah. Um, we've had these all sorts of different conceptions of God, from Zoroastrianism to different instantiations of Christianity that hold different ideas of God to the
But
the
I
Greeks
don't
and the
see how
Romans.
atheism can survive at scale without some sort of concept of God. I mean, I guess you bring up
I, well,
Buddhism.
what? Yeah, I do. And also the question is like, if you want to call the God, like, I hear a lot of religious people talk about this when they say like, everybody has a God and it's something.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, people have some like ultimate higher value. And that higher value can be many things. You yourself said, unless they make it out of the rational mind or the state or power. But why are you limiting it to those three things? That seems to not be a very creative use of imagination. Like,
Mm.
I just came up with one about like, the advance of Western civilization and like our part of like a directed goal towards
Progress.
better towards
Yeah.
eudaimonia,
Yeah.
I would say, yeah.
Yeah.
Not progress in a progressive sense, but yeah, that we are progressing towards something. I think Christians think that we're progressing towards something too.
Mm.
If it's the second coming or whatever it may be. Jews certainly think that we're progressing towards something, to the point where there's going to be an awakening of the spirituality of Jews that enables the Messiah to come.
Hmm.
Right. So everybody has this.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I think it's going to be something, and I also think the association of atheism with minimalist aesthetics is probably wrong. I mean, it could maybe be true in aggregate. I mean, you're correct here, but what you don't see is that over here is my beanbag where I meditate, and
Mm.
there's no physical sort of thing here,
Reminder, yeah.
but that, I often have a meditation bell that goes off, every couple hours or so as a reminder doing the same thing that you're describing. So it's not a physical sign on the wall, but it's something auditory.
Hmm.
And, you'll of course see all sorts of atheists that have spiritual practices of various kinds. In particular, I've
What
been an
attracted
advocate of,
you to meditation? Was this during your Sam Harris phase?
yeah, and I mean he's gone in a bad direction on a lot of different things, but his meditation app is still great, and I
Hmm.
recommend it to people. And what he's doing in that space,
What value do you
I think is good.
derive from meditation?
Um, I think that I gain a deeper sense of what we truly are in a way that is connecting and
Hmm.
positive, and sustaining. Um, I I think that this isn't too dissimilar from what religious people get out of their religions. For me, it just doesn't come with false or fact claims that I believe are false. Um,
That was very
I think
humble.
that
That was a humble
I,
reformulation on the fly.
well, yeah, I mean, I think it's objectively true.
Hmm.
I think we can know that. We know that the story in Genesis is not true. Various Christian denominations have tried to reinterpret that, but that all seems very convenient.
Hmm.
And many other claims, things we know where you would see archaeological evidence for certain claims that just isn't there. Um, anyway, so I think that the hard problem of consciousness is very interesting. I'm not a materialist. There is something other than physical atoms that makes up a core component of this reality. I don't know what it is, and I'm not prepared to make unevidenced claims about what it is. I just know that there's something. And I know that there's something because there's not a mechanistic reason why we would experience awareness. We would be unconscious computers that do all the things a human does, appear totally human, but did not have this like light of
Hmm.
awareness. So I think spending some time to see that and focus on that is connecting. And I don't want to make a God in the gaps argument of saying that because I've seen this and I've witnessed this and that all of us can see this and witness this, that therefore we know what it is. I don't know what it is, but it's
Hmm.
something.
Hmm. Do you have family plans? This is kind of a personal question. What about bringing more yous into the world? Is that on your
Yes.
docket? Is that one of your values?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm engaged,
Yeah.
which is different from last time I was
Congrats.
here. Thank
Yeah.
you. And yeah, we want to have kids, and we want to get married and start having kids soon. I think it's a little later for both of us than we would like.
Hmm.
I very much agree with religious people, and this is one of the things that I think needs to be conserved. There's nothing inherently religious about thinking that it's good to continue on and perpetuate the human species and really perpetuate yourself.
Hmm.
Um, I think so. As we discussed last time, I was raised Orthodox Jewish, and if you look at the ultra Orthodox Jews, which wasn't my community, but I had contact with them. They'll have like 12, 13 kids. And, I've seen my dad get letters in the mail where they beg for charity because they can't
Oh, yeah.
afford to raise the number of kids that they've had. And
Hmm.
so I think that the sort of simplified religious commandment version of it can be very maladaptive. And I've seen it be maladaptive. It's not right to raise kids in poverty. You've got to build your house and have a sustainable income and raise kids that you can raise sustainably on that income. Um, but the broader principle, I agree with that. I don't know how many kids we'll have, and I think that will be influenced by our financial ability.
Hmm.
It will not be 12, but it will hopefully be more than average.
Hmm. So, to kind of wrap things up, you have a new book out, Redefining
Hmm.
Racism. It's excellently composed, and
Thank
it
you.
goes through various arguments and historical analysis kind of where racism ended up and how you are arguing for consolidated, more clean, as you say, colorblind
Hmm.
version of combating racism. Isn't it? I wonder to what extent racism has become a thought terminating cliche, or in other terms, a totem that itself just needs to be let go of. It has too much cachet. When I started my work in the taco sphere, it was because of this anti racist racism at the
Hmm.
Evergreen State College. And I looked at that for a long time and I examined it and I broke it down and I regurgitated it. And at the end of the
Hmm.
day, I switched over to the other contentious issue of the day, gender, because racism
Hmm.
seems to be so entrenched to so many people's lives
Hmm.
and identities, racism itself, not just their race, but racism itself, that it just seems like a perpetual motion machine that just continually serves itself and is just kind of just a cultural engine. And then in 2020, it reached its zenith, and now it's kind of fallen to the wayside. There was this rather comical article in the New York Times, of all places, talking about how black women were trying to save the republic, and now they're just tired and they're going to go take naps because their candidate lost. You know,
Hmm.
it's just but this kind of post George Floyd era where Kendi and Robin DiAngelo and Ta-Nehisi Coates are kind of no longer the standard
Hmm.
bearers, and racism itself is kind of it's dubious to me. Why do we care so much about? Why do we spend so much time on it? How important is it? You said it's utterly evil, but I think that's almost giving it too much power. It shouldn't matter at all. That's my
Well,
position, but
there's a distinction between race and racism, right? Race shouldn't matter at all. That I agree with fully. And racism, apart from maybe
mm,
a small regression, over the last decade or so, in large part due to these woke figures
mm,
that you name, but then there's also been, I think a right-wing counter reaction in some corners. Is apart from that regression is the least important it's ever been in hundreds of years. And I think that's wonderful. I started writing this book in the period of peak wokeness, really before, actually. I had a lot of this story even before the George Floyd riots
mm,
started. And what the book does is it tells the history of this definition of racism that I was hearing around a lot back then, and you'll still hear it in academic spaces and many places it will come towards you, which is that racism is power plus prejudice.
mm.
And that sounded strange to me the first time I heard it because I've always understood racism to be prejudice or discrimination by race. And now what they're saying is, no, 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 we want to do that if it helps take down, the power group and restore basically, frankly, some
It goes
communist
back to
version
that
of
concept of
equality.
legal plunder,
Mhm.
basically, but it's moral plunder, moralistic
Yeah,
plunder.
yeah. I think that's a great phrase for it. So I wanted to understand where that came from, and so I tracked the lineage of that idea. And what I found is something not contradictory to, but distinct from, I think, the narrative that you uncovered at Evergreen and that, you know, um, our our friends Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay and Brett Weinstein and people like that have uncovered this critical theory and postmodernist academic grounding that certainly undergirds the ideology of it. But where in practice, like who first defined racism as power plus prejudice, and who got that to take it off, got that to take off, so that it's being used everywhere. Like I first heard it in a cable news interview,
Hmm.
and that it's often being used to excuse away racism when it does something in the name of woke social justice values. And what I found was that it came from white high school teachers in the Detroit area,
Hmm.
who had been inculcated with Black nationalist ideas and specifically Marxist Black nationalist ideas, like traditionally Marxist, namely from a guy named Stokely Carmichael, who was the founder of the Black Power movement, who he moved to Africa at one point in his career, like to form a communist, like Pan-African Black ethno state, and
How did
becomes
that work
friends
out?
with like poorly, and becomes friends with mass murdering dictators, such as Idi Amin. Um, so wacky guy.
Hmm.
Um, and what he was the head of a group called SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which at one time was a very important and positive civil rights group, but then got taken over by Carmichael and the Black Power segment. And when they did, they kicked out all their white activists and said, teach our ideas back in the white community. That merges with these white, again, not academics, high school educators,
Hmm.
who were trained in
And bad
this.
metaphors such as knapsacks.
Yes, yes, I mentioned Peggy McIntosh in that essay in the book, but this predates that. That's about 20 years later, I think.
Hmm.
This group dynamics psychological tool that's developed out of this organization called the National Training Laboratories. It still exists.
Hmm.
Um, and this they use psychologically manipulative techniques. The organization was literally founded by this psychologist named Kurt Lewin, who worked for the OSS during World War II, running psychological warfare operations. So, so they use the techniques from that to teach by white people teaching white people these ideas based on Black nationalism. They called it back then new white consciousness. And this was idea of like being aware of your nature, like as a white person. This predates critical race theory. This predates critical whiteness studies. Critical whiteness studies seems to take all this stuff up, but it's not the source of it. Um, and they teach this for a while, and they keep just trying to build their way into in institutions, and eventually it explodes with Robin DiAngelo, which we lived to witness. And it's this cult philosophy. Over the years they've managed to, believe it or not, as crazy as Robin DiAngelo sounds, sanitize a lot of it. But it's the exact same ideas. Like,
Hmm.
you wouldn't hear Robin DiAngelo say this, but you would hear the earlier ones, that the best you can be as a white person is an anti-racist racist because all white people are racist by definition.
Hmm.
Um, they called their philosophy new white consciousness, which is
Hmm.
culty. It literally was culty. The techniques that they learned at the NTL Institute were also used by famous cults, namely one called Synanon, which, like, it started as like, we're going to be a drug rehabilitation center like AA, but they shaved each other's heads, and they used this technique that it wasn't created at NTL, but it was derived from NTL techniques called attack therapy, where they just yell at each other and like break them down and cause all these like psychological
Struggle
issues to
sessions, yeah.
like get them to change. Yeah, struggle sessions. And so I think this white anti-racism, we've long called it a cult, but I think I make the argument here. It's not just like a cult, it
Yeah.
is a cult. It
Yeah.
uses the same cult dynamics techniques that were
Hmm.
used by famed cults. It has the same intellectual lineage in large parts. You just are mixing different things into it.
Hmm.
Instead of this Alcoholics Anonymous like stuff, instead of a lot of other things that cults might be based in, it was this anti-racism, this new white consciousness that they developed. So that's
Wow.
the book, and I do think it matters. Like, I really believe in anti-racism properly defined. Like, I this book comes out of my work against identity politics. Identity politics about race are
Hmm.
inherently racist.
Hmm.
I want to have that colorblind society. I think we have regressed, and I don't want to see that regression get worse because, I think we know the cruelty that was done to people because of racist beliefs. And I just think I think it matters. Like, yeah, it's not as serious now as it was, in the early 1960s, but we're forgetting something. And I think that it's important we remember that. And that's why, this book is about protecting the definition of racism. It's telling the story of these people that work to redefine racism, to make it a tool towards their activist ends, that manipulated language to just kind of slyly swap out the concepts that we've all been using, that we all used to understand each other. But then by just telling people, no, you didn't understand it fully, it actually meant this, they've managed to change their ideology without many people being even aware that that's been done to them. So, I hope by telling this story, I hope I can get some, liberal minded but left wing people to realize what's been done to them and return to the truly anti-racist philosophy of the civil rights movement.
I think we can make a case, mutually beneficial, that if somebody starts by watching Am I a Racist? Like, oh, yeah, this stuff is kind of silly. And then they graduate to the Evergreen Story documentary that I did. And you're like, no, this is actually totally crazy. And I think your book fits in the slide to why the people were acting as they were acting at Evergreen. That's one of the biggest responses to the Evergreen documentary that I did. It's like, why are they acting this way? What do they want? Why are they acting this way? And it's a total, you can scan it as a cult, but I think and at the center of, or at the root of it, is Robin DiAngelo. And her ideas are explicitly stated at the very beginning of their whole transformation into an anti-racist college. They brought in Robin DiAngelo's ideas, and then they had her come in and teach. You're like, this is absolute insanity stuff to make, to use as the foundation for a college, let alone for a society or like a little social experiment. And no wonder it turned out the way it is. But I think that your book fits into actually like breaking down historically and ideologically through the kind of their own version of rationality or purification. They say, well, simplification or vanillification maybe is another term. Purification of these ideas from a lineage that's what, 80, 100 years old now.
So the story that I tell starts in the year 1967, but of course you can start this at any point because everything has a precedent. And you can look at my story picks up with classical Marxism. So you could go back and look at the origins of classical Marxism. You could look at tribal psychology and how something like Marxism was even able to take off and appeal to people. But I start in the year 1967 because there were major riots across the United States that year. And the biggest of them was in Detroit. And it was the reaction to those riots that got the funding for these people to spread their philosophy. So at the time, Mitt Romney's father, George Romney, was the governor of Michigan. And he and the mayor and city business leaders, they wanted to stop riots like this from happening again. So they engaged in what was widely referred to as riot insurance, where they paid off, Black nationalists to go do their projects. And one of the things that got funded by that organization was an organization called New Perspectives on Race. And this New Perspectives on Race publishes the high school curriculum for an anti-racism course where power plus prejudice is used as a definition for the first time, where it first appears on print ever. Wow. And it's just a single bullet point. Doesn't explain why it's there, doesn't explain how they came to that definition. And so, it took a lot of research to kind of uncover that mystery. And that's the story I tell. So that's why it starts in 1967, but you could really start it at any point.
Yeah. Well, Jake, great to have you back on. I'll link to your work in the description as well as to your press. Why don't you plug it one more time?
The book is Redefining Racism, How Racism Became Power Plus Prejudice. You can get it anywhere you buy your books. But if you go to wetheblacksheep.com, you can order either a signed version from our shop, or if you want to have the ebook, if you subscribe at wetheblacksheep.com, which is the URL for our Substack, the ebook comes free included. We also have the audiobook for audiobook fans that is on Spotify and Audible. So
Great.
people can get it that way. I narrate it. So if you've enjoyed my perhaps not
Dulcet
so
tones.
soothing voice over this podcast, then I hope you'll like the audiobook. And thank you so much for having me, Benjamin. This is a really fun conversation. It's, I feel like this time and the last time we were on, we debate. And we disagree on like things that I think are very important to both of us. But at the same time, I really have this sense that we're so close together. But the things where we disagree are these things that like we can latch onto and that actually do have like great importance. But it's like everything surrounding those little things we agree on. And so when I say like I've been listening to your podcast a lot more lately, like this is a great show, and you're a really important voice. And I really enjoy talking to you, and I really enjoy listening to your conversations with other people. I've been hearing you say a lot that, you have a more liberal disposition as you talk about these, very conservative ideas. And I think that's really important. I think we need more of that because you have a certain presentation of these ideas that I think can reach a lot more people that need to be reached by these ideas. I started listening more. I mean, I've always listened to your show even before I was on it the first time, like now and then if you had a guest. But I started listening to it a lot more after the whole Martyr Maid incident went down because I'm a huge fan of his podcast. And the way in which you navigated that discourse was, I think, so similar to the way I was navigating it. And you were really doing it really well. And your conversation with Constantine also, I don't know if you know this, I did a debate back in May at an event called Dissonant Dialogues where I debated the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and Constantine moderated that. Okay. And he claimed at the time to be neutral. He claimed at the time to be neutral on this conflict. And I don't think he was. I mean, I think he was like clearly on the other side. I think his more recent like coming out of I finally made my decision is like totally fraudulent. But even worse, I think that the woke right stuff that he's been pushing, and James Lindsay too, and I love James Lindsay, so I want to give him a little bit more slack. But this like pure projection of, Zionism is actually identity politics, right? It's the idea that we're going to form an ethno-state based on not even Jewish religion, but based purely on ancestral ties, and I guess you can convert, and that we're going to exclude all these other people that lived in this area historically to make space for our ethno-state. And the victimhood politics, and believe me, like, I've been to Auschwitz, I've been to concentration camps, I've been to Israel too. But, like the Holocaust is a very serious thing in my mind. And it's something that needs to be talked about and deserves to be talked about. It should be remembered forever. But the victimhood politics that have arisen out of, complaints about anti-Semitism, sometimes very legitimate, sometimes not so legitimate, but to justify this identity politics project, it so mirrors, it so mirrors what a woke right would be, that just the pure projection from them to label us the woke right, I just find that so scummy. And so thank you for being an important voice against that and for all the things that you do.
I should hire you as my publicist. That was brilliant. I feel very, very good about myself now. I want to go out
I'm
and
happy.
produce more.
We're really expanding what we're doing at the Black Sheep. And, one of the things we want to start doing more regularly is, I notice one of the things you do about your podcast, which I was prepared for this time, but the last time I was like, am I doing something wrong? Is you do just start recording without people knowing. And I was like, the last time I was on, I was like, oh, am I supposed to know that? But now the amount of guests that I've seen you have on that are like, wait, are we recording? You do that to everyone and you know what you're doing,
I
but
know
it
I
makes it
shouldn't.
more. But it makes it more of a hangout. And so we're
Yeah,
going to start regular live streams. We'd love to have you on and just hang
absolutely.
out and chat. We're probably going to start a more formal podcast too. And
Okay.
so hopefully you can come on ours as well when we start it soon. And
Well,
we'll talk
I'd
more
love to
about these ideas.
meet you and your fiance and hopefully meet up in person. And that was the final
Mhm.
question for the show. What's coming up with Black Sheep Publishing?
Well, it's
What do
not
you got?
just books.
Yeah.
We're starting multiple times a week live stream show.
Hmm.
We are publishing articles at least twice a week, but probably more than that going forward. That either talk about the ideas behind the black sheep archetype, try to be the black sheep, and challenge held ideas that maybe need some challenging, or that tell the stories of people that have gone through these experiences,
Yeah.
and their black sheep journey of coming to truths that maybe you and I might recognize, but the community that they come from didn't recognize, and how they coped through that difficult process to, number one, just because it's interesting, but two, to help sustain other people who need to be that voice in a community or a collective that's become dysfunctional, to have the courage to do that. We're going to start an advice column that's along those lines. So
Hmm.
we have a lot of different projects coming. Please subscribe at wetheblacksheep.com. It's, you know, free to be a free subscriber. But of course, I'm trying to do this full time. My fiance is also going to try to do this full time. And so any support, really makes a difference. And so if you want to come be a
Hmm.
paid subscriber, you get the book, and you're going to get access to private live streams, and you're going to get access to our whole article archives and all sorts of great stuff. So we'd love to have anyone.
I do have to comment that there's something slightly Abrahamic about the black sheep as a symbol. So I'm just going to put that out there.
Explain that. I'm
So
curious.
there's this guy named Abraham, and he had a
Mhm,
son from his concubine or his midwife, and then
mhm,
he finally gets his own son with his actual wife
mhm.
Sarah, and then God's like, here, I gave you this gift. Now go out into the forest and sacrifice your son to me. And Abraham's like, shit. Well, God's great, so I'm gonna have to do this thing. Takes his kid out, and is going to go through with the deed, but God sees that Abraham's true of heart and is truly trying to follow God's law, and so swaps out his son for this ram. I don't know if it's a black ram or not, but
Mm.
there's something about the shepherd and the sheep that echoes throughout that your origin story, your tradition. So there's a background radiation of these symbols.
Well, you,
And
well,
also, you can go the Martyr Maid
yeah,
split, where some of his best episodes talk about his faith, and he really goes into
mhm,
why
yeah,
why the martyr is such an important symbol
yeah.
to him and his work. And there is something about the black sheep that is the scapegoat and the martyr for
I
the black
I think it really
bad blood.
connects to the
Yeah.
martyrs of theology. I won't go into that whole Jacob story because I think we're going to disagree about like the value of that story. But I will say that I think if you're pointing out not just that a ram was sacrificed, but that Abraham is a black sheep to the
Mm.
community that he was in, I think
Yeah.
that that's a correct interpretation. And I think that this black sheep cycle, it plays out. There's an ossified community.
Mm.
It's gotten something wrong in its ossification. It needs somebody that's telling it the message of, hey, like, I'm part of this community, but you've gotten things wrong, right? And the community has a chance to react to that. And then, the black sheep might have to go its own way. Either the black sheep succeeds or it has to go its own way. But if it goes
And
its
there's
own
some
way,
sacrifice that's inevitable.
it has to then try to build something new, and then that new thing that was created by a black sheep can get ossified, and it needs a new black sheep, and this is a recurring cycle
Mm.
throughout history. So I think it's archetypically interesting. I think it gives us a lot to play with.
Hmm.
We talk about politics, but we also talk about philosophy, history, culture. Like
Yeah.
this dynamic shows up in so many different ways.
It's a very dynamic too. Jake Klein, your awesome. It's great to chart your development as a businessman and as a thinker too. And so thank you for coming back on the show. And I'll link to all your work in the description.
Thank you. You too. Have a great day.
You too. Cool. Now